Welcome to the second episode of Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman. I'm the associate editor of the New York Sun, and I'm joined every week by my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, a columnist for the Sun. We know that the world can make you crazy, and so we're here to help you make sense out of the nonsense and help restore a bit of sanity to your week.
We like to start every podcast with a quote about sanity, and this one comes from Peter Thiel, entrepreneur and investor, who said, "We might describe the world as having retail sanity, but wholesale madness." And I think that's going to apply to a lot of what we talk about today, Ari.
And we're especially excited to have our first guest, Professor Jed Rubenfeld of Yale University, an expert on constitutional law and free speech, to help us break down the legal dimensions of Trump's second term.
Ari and I are so excited to welcome today our first ever guest on the Sanity podcast, Jed Rubenfeld. Welcome, Jed.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Professor Rubenfeld is a professor of law at Yale Law School. He's a constitutional scholar, and we know he's a scholar because he was smart enough to marry Amy Chua. He also has a tremendous video series on YouTube that I love called Straight Down the Middle, which I really recommend to all of you. To those of you like me who don't have law degrees and you want to understand the most important cases affecting our country today, Jed does a masterful job in Straight Down the Middle, and I really suggest that you check it out. And the last little biographical piece of information I want to share about Jed is that in addition to his degrees from Harvard and Princeton, he also went to Juilliard. And so if we conduct the interview well, Ari, maybe Jed will break out in song or we'll get lucky. Something like that will happen.
Well, we're in the market for new theme music. So
well, there you go. Something with sun in the name, please.
Right. No chance.
All right. Why don't you take it away, Ari?
Well, we're so grateful to have you here, Jed, and mostly because it seems that there's an enormous amount of constitutional and legal ferment happening right now. You know, the phrase constitutional moment or constitutional crisis, as we spoke about last week, is thrown around a lot. But it really does feel that at the beginning of this Trump 2.0 term, the president is really focused on marking the boundaries of his power. And I think I'm surprised by the extent to which the relationship of the president to the federal government and to the executive branch in particular has been an early focus for this administration. So if you could start off just telling us, what are you seeing as the main kind of constitutional themes that are emerging from these first few months of the 47th president's term?
Great question. Yeah. Let me first talk about this term, constitutional crisis, which, a lot of people are worried about. Here's the line in the sand I would recommend that all your viewers watch for, and that's defiance of a judicial order. When that happens, when and if the Trump administration says, well, okay, you ordered that, but we're not going to follow it, that's a tripwire. That's a line in the sand. If we cross that point, I think it becomes appropriate at that point to start worrying about a constitutional crisis. It's the fact that in our country, the administration obeys orders from the judiciary, that it's that little paper-thin line that separates us from being an autocracy or a dictatorship. So you got to be super careful about any time an administration says, look, we're just not going to follow this order. And my feeling right now is that has not happened, and I'm giving the benefit of the doubt to the Trump administration, in part because I know some of the people there, but also in part because he's been president before. And you may remember, and just stop me if I'm going on too long here, but you may remember, like it was week 1 or week 2 of Trump 1.0, where a little district court out in Hawaii said, that travel ban, it was being called like the Muslim travel ban, you know what, that's unconstitutional, and issued a nationwide injunction blocking that. Now, there's plenty of lawyers, plenty of law professors who think that district courts in various parts of the country should not have the power to issue nationwide injunctions. It's a non-crazy position to say we're not going to obey that on a nationwide basis. We think you don't have that power.
And that's come from both the right and the left,
Absolutely.
right? I mean,
That's not a partisan.
Just to fill people in, a nationwide injunction is where one federal judge can decide a question of national import, and their ruling holds for everybody. And this has come up with the so-called abortion pill, other issues from across the political spectrum.
Ari, you're absolutely right. So that's a nonpartisan issue in the sense that people on both sides have had problems with that, and guess what? They obeyed it. They obeyed it. And by the way, I think that case went up to the Supreme Court, and I think basically that travel ban was, more or less upheld. But they obeyed that district court injunction. They did not. I thought they were going to just defy it, and I thought, okay, here we go, constitutional crisis right from the gate. But instead, they didn't. And what's been happening with these executive orders? There was the most contentious one was maybe that order issued by Judge Paul Engelmeyer of the Southern District here in New York, saying, enjoining DOJ from getting access to Treasury data. And it looked like the order some people were interpreting it, maybe it prevents the Secretary of the Treasury from getting access. Well, in one of Danielle Sassoon's last filings in that case, she said, look, we're going to comply with this order, but we need clarification of what it means, but we will comply with whatever you're saying. So far, they are... they're complying, and some people say, well, but they're evading the spirit. Like there was a judicial order saying, this freezing of funds, you got to stop that. You got to lift that freezing of funds. The funds have to start being paid, and so it's true the administration is still holding back on many of the funds that they purported to freeze, but they're doing so under other statutory authorizations. So some people are saying, "Oh, you're evading the court order," but don't forget. That's presidents do. That's what President Biden did after the Supreme Court said, "Oh, that loan forgiveness thing. Well, that was you exceeded your statutory authority." They struck it down, and then he found other statutory bases on which to do the same thing. And so that's not the same as just defying a court order.
So a lot of us, look at these cases and see these district courts that, issue rulings that have import for the entire country. And we can't understand, A, where that comes from and why it is that way. So maybe you could just give us a little lesson about, has that always been the case? And should that be something that we solve for? Or is there something in that offers protection that we want to keep? And then this question of, I'm interested in Ari's initial question about why Trump picked this fight to start with almost, and what you think that means for him and for the country, and where you think the limits of his success should be. How much do we want him to win? Yes,
well, he is potentially revolutionizing the scope of executive authority. I think this is what Ari was asking about, and he is not just like staking out his authority. He is pushing the boundaries of existing limits on executive authority. But none of the points at which he's applying pressure is one that I would call, constitutional crisis material. On the contrary, there are arguments, decent, perfectly good arguments about why the president should be able to fire the people in his administration, rather than having officers or officials who take action that he doesn't want the executive to take, and he can't do anything about it. So there's a perfectly good argument, and the name that this argument goes by is the unitary executive theory. You'll probably be reading about that, or your viewers may have seen that, but that's the position that says, look, the president has the power should have full power over the executive branch, and Congress shouldn't be able to stop him from, for example, firing people who aren't obeying his will.
Yeah, and I think that is sort of underrated, is the fact that the fights Trump the Trump administration is picking are kind of classical ones. Any sort of 1L con law class, you read about the president's authority over autonomous agencies, the ability to hire and fire, the possibility of taking on the case of Humphrey's executive. I mean, there's a long tradition here, not only of presidents standing up to the courts, and famously Andrew Jackson told John Marshall to enforce his ruling, and there have been other clashes since, but also this question of where the limits of the presidency lie is one that's as old as the Republic.
Right. So sticking with this issue of can the president fire officers? So right now, a case or issue being litigated is, can the president fire this guy Hampton Dellinger, who is the special counsel right now? And that's the case. It's already made it up to the Supreme Court. I don't know if they'll rule on it in its current procedural posture, but it's already up in the Supreme Court, and that's going to test this unitary executive theory. It's going to maybe test Humphrey's executive, but guess what? He's got the conservative justices on his side on this. All their decisions over the last several years have been pointing in the direction of yes, they're going to let him fire this guy and cut back this case that Ari was mentioning, Humphrey's executor, even further than it's already been cut back. And the big ticket item there to watch out for is like the Fed. Is it going to be that the president can fire members of the Federal Reserve Board? That's not on the table. He hasn't purported to do that. That's like the big ticket item there. This is a very different case, the Hampton Dellinger case. And I suspect, I don't know if it'll happen in this round, but I suspect he'll win that case. Full disclosure, Hampton Dellinger's son is a student of mine at Yale, and Hampton's father was a colleague at Duke. But I suspect Trump's going to win that one. But the point is, so those are things he's pushing on, and I think has a very good chance of winning. A different issue is, what if Congress says to him, you can't do something that isn't considered within the sole and plenary power of the president? Congress passes a statute and says, for example, we order you to spend this money on this program. And most people don't think that that's a unitary, plenary, sole power that only the president has, where you're talking where the Constitution gives the president the sole power to do something. Then Congress can't come in and tell him not to. That's the idea of the president having sole and plenary power over something. But most people don't think that's true about spending. They might think that's true about firing an executive officer that wields significant executive power. Most people don't think that's true about spending. So I think he might lose that fight.
Right. And spending is at the heartland of the legislative power, the power of the purse. It's worth wondering, though, into this political moment, whether Congress would be able to assert itself that way. And this could come up, though, in terms of Trump's vows or plans to eliminate some federal agencies, right, which have been established by legislative statute. We spoke last week about USAID and in some sense the Department of Education. There I could see those are inter-branch clashes could be coming down the pike.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's going to be... So first of all, you got to interpret the statutes that have been enacted. And so question one will be, do these statutes permit or forbid the president to abolish an agency, abolish a department? There was a statute some decades ago that gave the president reorganization power. This term reorganization just means getting to abolish, reduce the size of, eliminate completely an agency or a department. And that statute was around for a while. It had a complicated procedure to it, but it doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of people think the president does not have the power right now to eliminate a department, that the statute that created the department doesn't give the president that power. But that's the first question. Does the statute permit the president to get rid of it? If it doesn't, is that a core plenary presidential power? Can Congress stick him with an agency, a department that he doesn't want? So far, there's no decided cases that strongly suggest that he's going to have that power regardless of what the Congress wants to do about it. So that's going to be another very important site of contest.
Can I just ask you a question about the spending? I'm curious about this. If the president, I guess we're about to find out if the president can or cannot cancel congressional allotments to certain agencies, USAID. But if they assign $50 million a year to USAID, but there's no line item budget, doesn't say where, it's just you get the money. Can the president go in if he finds fraud or sending the money to a third party or whatever they are finding right now, Doge is finding, can he retain the overall budget that Congress assigned, but can he cancel those specific payments to those particular agencies or NGOs?
Well, again, it's kind of a boring type of answer, but you're going to have to look carefully at the statute. So some statutes use the word shall.
That's not the answer I wanted.
No, some statutes use the word may. And it makes a big difference. If the statute says that the president shall spend this money on such and such a program, it's specific and it uses mandatory language, there's no doubt under current law he's got to do it. Now, side note, his lawyers are currently taking the position that no, he doesn't have to, even if it's mandatory. So they say that any attempt by Congress to impose mandatory requirements where he has to spend money, those are unconstitutional. But I don't think they have much in the way of case law to back up that claim. Now, if the statute just says, here's an amount of money, but we're not telling you what to spend it on, was that the kind of question you're asking?
I mean, I'm assuming nobody said spend money on sending Medicare and Medicaid funds to people overseas or giving funds to dead people. So if that's not the specific use of the money that was assigned, can he say, well, clearly there's some fraud here or abuse, and I'm not going to spend it in that way?
Yes, exactly. If the statute authorizes a certain amount of money and leaves it up to the president or the relevant agency to decide, leaves them with discretion about where to spend that money, then the president's going to have a whole lot of authority over it. And he's going to say, it's not up to the agency, it's up to me. Mm-hmm. And I am the one who's going to exercise that discretion to decide where this $500 million or $5 billion goes. Mm-hmm. And so a lot depends on what the statute says. Mm-hmm. And statutes can give the president a lot of discretion here.
I'm wondering, though, are we sort of underestimating some of the voices, maybe not in the White House, but in Trump world generally, who are formulating a more confrontational, constitutional posture? I mean, you read some of the things that the vice president has tweeted about the ability of judges to restrain the executive seem to me hinting towards a more radical understanding of the relationship of the judiciary to the executive. People in the president's orbit, like Stephen Miller, have also posted to X understandings that seem to me a little more exotic relative to the mainstream of constitutional history. I mean, do you see those voices in sort of, let's call it Trump world more generally, that are agitating for a more confrontational relationship, antagonistic relationship with the courts over the question of restraint of presidential action? Oh, for sure. And you see this on X all the time. Impeach those judges and don't follow anything they say if they're getting in our way. But look, let's talk politics for a second. He's got a majority in both houses, but not just that, he has 6 conservative justices. This is the wrong time to pick a fight with the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. They're basically on your side. They're basically going to probably uphold a lot of what you want to do. Now you're going to pick a fight and say, we don't have to follow anything you say. You're going to pick the worst possible fight at the worst possible time. I just don't think so. So I've seen some hints, among some people, and even when it comes to lower courts, and this is what we were talking about before, the correct thing for them to do is to appeal. If they don't like some little district judge somewhere who issues a nationwide injunction, the right thing for them to do is appeal to a circuit court, and to try, if they want to change that rule, the change should come either from a statute or from eventually the Supreme Court. They say, you know what? The District of Hawaii only has power to rule within that district. And then the circuit court, let's say the Ninth Circuit that the Hawaii ruling would go up to, they only have the power to rule within their jurisdiction. You could have jurisdictional limits on every court. The reason why we don't is because then you have problems of non-uniformity. So in California, like a certain federal law has been enjoined, but in New York it's okay, and it all gets very confusing. So the reason why we got to where we are is to try to have uniformity across the country on these federal law issues. But it creates these problems with little judges out in, podunk saying, what.
Well, net, do you think that that's a good thing or not a good thing? Would you, Jed Rubenfeld, abolish that or keep it as it is?
I'm against district court judges having the power to issue nationwide injunctions. The reason why is because it encourages forum shopping, and then everybody runs to the same judge, and that's a bad look and a bad thing for a legal system. And which judge gets to order first, and then and then what happens?
The forum shopping is really doing terrible damage to people's trust in the judicial system in this country. I think the average person, they look at that and they see it as political.
Yeah, nobody likes that. So for that's what tipped me over to. But there are problems on the other side, problems of non-uniformity and chaos, confusion. Where does an order apply? Where doesn't it apply?
Right.
I think a good example or an issue that sort of brings together a lot of the things we've been speaking about is the birthright citizenship question, right? There's a policy dimension to this. Is it a good thing in general? There's a constitutional element to this. What does the 14th Amendment say? And I think for a lot of critics of the administration, this is kind of ground zero for their allegations that this is unconstitutional, right? But there's also a sense in which it's taking the usual course. It's being enjoined. It's being appealed in a range of circuits. So just losing in court is not necessarily the same, right, as a constitutional crisis.
Oh, completely not. That's standard. Presidents are always losing in court on some cases, winning in some others. This is not a constitutional crisis. I mean, some people see it as an assault on the 14th Amendment. Well, some people see it that way. Other people think that, there's a case to be made in favor of that executive order. Now, I myself think it's unconstitutional. We could talk about that if you want, but it's proceeding in exactly the way it's supposed to. A bunch of judges have already enjoined it and said it's unconstitutional, and now it's going to go up to the appellate courts. It'll eventually go to the Supreme Court, I assume. But that's a standard operating procedure. Nothing wrong with that. And
judicial long shots have often been the preferred means of changing sort of consensus over time. I mean, if you go back and say, what is something that felt like a twinkle in somebody's eye and eventually was vindicated, in the long run of history, you'd have most issues.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, sure. How about Brown versus Board of Education?
Right.
It took a long time. But yeah, so I'm in favor of a lot of the executive orders that Trump passed, and this, you can't keep up with them, and that's, I guess, part of the point, part of the politics of it. But I think I support a lot of what he's doing through these executive orders. The birthright citizenship executive order is the one clear example of one where I think it's crossed a constitutional line. But so far, there's nothing crisis-like about that.
Maybe we can shift over to another of Jed's specialties, and that's free speech.
Yes, please. Let's talk about free speech.
Do you want to speak first?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
No, well, one of the ways in which I became familiar with your work actually was through the Murthy v. Biden case, which became Murthy v. Missouri. And I wrote a column about it for The Sun at the time. And I don't know what to say. I don't even know where to start, but I think I'm going to start with somebody, again, who's not a lawyer. I was astounded by the violation of our free speech rights in this country. I literally sound naive when I say it, but I was actually astounded that the government could do what it did. And you may want to get into some of the details about the case, but what I wanted to get to was the result, which astounded me even more, that we didn't end up really winning that case. And so my first reaction, and I think I bumped into you at a cocktail party once and sort of attacked you with this question. How is it possible that the government of the United States could violate the First Amendment? In this case, it was demonstrated that the Biden administration had worked with Google and Facebook and other big tech companies to suppress the free speech of Americans on issues, everything from COVID to the Hunter Biden laptop. It was just clear that it had happened. And how is it possible that they could do that and that the penalty is an injunction? Basically, don't do that again. There must be some great legal understanding of this that I'm missing, but that seems like the absence of a great disincentive, or the absence, there's no disincentive there. And why wouldn't they just do it again? Maybe with a different agency or under a different. I was upset about it, to say the least. So I need you to help me come down from the tree I've climbed and explain to me how this is possible.
I'm pretty shocked too. So I don't know how much help I'm going to be to you, but remember, the Supreme Court even threw out the injunction. So in the end, we didn't even get the injunction. But just to take a step back.
Did I misspeak? I thought there was was it a temporary restraining order or an injunction?
There was an injunction issued by the Fifth Circuit.
Yes, okay.
And then the Supreme Court threw it out.
Right.
I can explain a little bit about that. But what Rebecca's talking about is a case where people sued officials in the Biden administration and the White House itself, Biden himself, for trying to pressure and collude with social media companies to censor protected speech. In my opinion, it was one of the most important free speech cases of the last several decades. What was happening, this is how I sort of started becoming a free speech lawyer again, because as a law professor, I hadn't done that much actual lawyering for a couple of decades. And then I wake up one day and people aren't able to post on social media that COVID might have originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. That's getting censored. It's suppressed. And if you say it a couple times, then they terminate your whole account. Or even
Dear reader, it probably did originate in a lab in Wuhan.
Well, yeah, I mean, and at the time people were saying it, it certainly hadn't been proven false at the time, and it probably is going to end up being true. But the point is, true or false, how can you not be able to say that, to speculate about that? Or later, you could not say, look, even if you get the vaccine, you can still get COVID. Because at first, the CDC was denying that. If you remember, they were saying, no, if you get the vaccine, you can't get it. It's a vaccine. Right. And it turned out, yes, you could. And we learned a new name for that, breakthrough infections. But for months, you could not say it might have originated in Wuhan, China. You could not say that the vaccines they may not stop you they may not prevent people from getting the illness. So it was crazy. I mean, I was thinking, what country am I living in where, on the main, in the main public forums where people speak, you're not allowed to say certain things? I was shocked. Now, I started publishing some articles like 5 years ago saying this is a First Amendment problem. And people were saying, well, but the First Amendment doesn't apply to private companies, which it does not. And they were saying, well, this guy claims to be a Yale professor. Doesn't he know anything? And I said, yeah, of course, it doesn't apply directly to Google or Facebook or Twitter as it was known then. But what it does apply to is if the government is in there telling them what they should censor and pressuring them to censor stuff and colluding with them, conspiring with them, inducing them to censor stuff, then you got a First Amendment problem. And at first people were saying that's ridiculous. There's no reason to think the government's doing that. Of course, now we all know, in part because of this case that Rebecca's talking about, which was, I think, called Missouri versus Biden first. And we now know that that's exactly what was happening. And so the district court in that case, it issued an injunction saying this is the most massive attack on the freedom of speech that perhaps in our nation's history. Right. The Fifth Circuit upheld almost entirely that injunction. And then the Supreme Court reversed it, said there's no standing. Standing is this like technical legal concept about whether the people suing have a right to sue. Do you know that my case is the only case still standing after the Supreme Court threw out the Murthy case?
Kennedy v. Biden?
Yes, Kennedy versus Biden. So my client was Bobby Kennedy. Of course, that suit involves Bobby Kennedy suing the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is now Bobby Kennedy. Right. So he had to drop out as plaintiff because you can't sue yourself. Yes. So, but there are other plaintiffs in the case, and that case is still alive. But
the difference there being that your plaintiffs have what you would describe as standing.
Yes, and the district court so held, and then the Fifth Circuit reversed. But now, of course, everything's kind of on hold because we got a new administration. What are they going to do? But so we don't know. So I also, full disclosure, am involved in the case you're talking about. I'm a lawyer in the case. I have clients in the case, but I absolutely think it was an outrageous violation of the First Amendment, and I was stunned that the Supreme Court threw it out. And to just finish out the point that Rebecca is making about injunctions, so right now the law is that if federal officials violate your First Amendment rights, you can't sue them for damages. All you can get is an injunction. So if they stop doing it, then they say, oh, no, don't worry, we're not going to do it anymore. The Fifth Circuit amazingly said the government has told you they're not going to do it anymore. So, there's no standing here. So you get these terrible holdings where the government does something for 2 years, violating people's First Amendment rights, and there's no remedy at all.
So now I'm despairing.
Let me ask a dumb question. Why wouldn't like a Section 1983 suit apply? That's the law that allows for monetary recovery, right? For if a government official violates your civil rights. Mm.
Well, you guys know so much. I have to hesitate before I say anything. But so Section 1983 is the general federal statute that allows people to bring to file damages actions for the violation of their constitutional rights. But guess what? It doesn't apply to federal officials. It's only state and local officials, and actually not even state officials. But you can sue them individually. You can sue cities for damages. You can sue state officials and city officials individually for damages, but the one group you can't sue is the federal government, federal agencies, or federal officials under Section 1983. What that's called the alternative is called a Bivens action, you may vaguely remember. So for some constitutional rights, like if a federal official violates your Fourth Amendment rights, you can sue for damages. But the Supreme Court has said not for the First Amendment, so It's kind of
so
surprising.
should I just live in despair, or do you have some remedy for this? If you were going to wave your magic legal wands, maybe both of you, what could we cook up that would prevent against this going forward, or is it just something we all have to live with? We actually have no freedom of speech at the end of the day.
If the case were still alive and cooking, and right now it's on hold, I would have tried to challenge this holding about there being no damages remedy for First Amendment violations by federal actors. So, of course, I would have tried to challenge that. The injunctive remedy, though, that's where a court says you have to stop doing this. And it declares to the whole country what you have been doing is a violation of the Constitution, and you can't do it anymore. And you know what? I would have been very happy to get that result and have it affirmed by the Supreme Court. You have a Supreme Court holding saying what the Biden administration did for the last 2 years, or for those main couple of years during COVID, that should never again happen in this country. I would have taken that in a heartbeat. And we didn't get it. They kicked the case out for lack of standing.
Let me ask you a question about free speech in a little bit of a different key. And this is something I think Rebecca and I may disagree a little bit about. And so let's go to kind of the campus setting. Mm-hmm. And we've seen the Trump administration, I think fair to say, attack the issue of anti-Semitism on campus in a fairly robust way across a suite of executive orders and actions. And part of that, both in terms of coming from the feds, and also we've seen schools move in response. For example, Harvard adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as part of its settlement with a group of Jewish students. We've seen the administration make moves towards deporting students who express sympathy for Hamas or other terrorist organizations. I mean, do you support that kind of thing? How do you understand the free speech issue as it transpires on campus?
It's a great question, and I think a tough one. I'm a free speech absolutist, and I know Rebecca has written about this too. I refuse to get behind these calls to suppress this pro-Hamas speech. I couldn't be more against it. Those butchers. The fact that if you had told me 5 years ago that our finest universities were going to become hotbeds of anti-Semitism, I'm just going to say it honestly because I think that's what's happened, and hotbeds of pro-Hamas protests, I would have said there's no way, that's ridiculous. That'll never happen. But I cannot get behind people trying to suppress their speech, so I just can't do that. Here's why it's a tough question, though. It's the double standard thing. So for years, the universities were suppressing speech. They were suppressing typically conservative speech. You use the wrong pronouns, you get hauled before a disciplinary committee. I could tell you harrowing tales of how this played out at Yale Law School, where I work, where a kid was hauled before a disciplinary committee and threatened for his whole career because he used words that, if I told you what they were, you'd say, I can't even understand it. But like they were supposed to be racist, which they weren't. But for that kind of non-offense offense, they were threatening him, calling him racist. So when they suddenly flip around and say, well, now there's free speech for that, that's what creates the problem. If free speech is going to be used as if it's going to be a double standard, a hypocritical double standard, where, they suppress the speech of one side and let the speech of the other, that creates a huge problem. And I think that's what people saw during, you remember the hearings with Claudine Gay and the others. That's what people were really reacting to. But as a sort of matter of principle, no, I can't get behind. Like we had a professor, I'm not going to mention her name, but we had a professor in the undergraduate university at Yale who tweeted on October 8th, or maybe even the 7th that night, exulting in that day. And there was a petition signed by 30,000 people. It's got to be fired. And I said, no, you can't fire her. You can't, we're supposed to be in favor of freedom of speech. This is the most awful tweet I can imagine anybody saying, but you can't fire her for it.
Yeah, we talked about those petitions before, and I had told you, I think, that when I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and we've had our own set of issues. I'm not a proud alum, to say the least. But when the petitions were circulated in the beginning to suppress the speech of the people who were saying all the things that I would never want my twin 18-year-olds to have to hear on campus, I refused to sign. Mm-hmm. And just like you, just as disgusted by Hamas and its behavior, but I never want that standard to be used against us in our speech, whether I'm a conservative or a Zionist, and it often is. And so I don't think that these are the remedies, especially if you're a Jew on campus. I think it's a huge mistake to to think that you're saving yourselves by suppressing the speech of others always redounds back to our, not to our benefit. But just quickly, Ari, I just want to ask one other thing. What I am a free speech absolutist, nearly. On campus, the one thing I do wonder about is the free speech of faculty. Not on their own personal social media pages, but I really don't understand why faculty or in positions of authority and can give grades to students should have the right to join in protests on campus. They can protest 3 blocks outside of campus if they want to, but should faculty have the free speech on campus that it looks like they have, and why isn't anybody doing anything about that? Jed Rubenfeld.
Well, as a faculty member at one of these colleges, I'm probably going to be maybe more in favor of free speech for faculty members than you're suggesting. So I'm not sure about that. But here's what I think in part is going on. There are some competence issues where I think universities can take a hard look and do something where some professor teaches a course, they suddenly name themselves an expert in some area and they start teaching some crazy stuff to their students. And I think universities are permitted to do a competence review of what's being taught in their schools. I mean, there's going to be a clash between that and the traditional idea of tenure. You're allowed to teach whatever you want, so there's going to be clashes about that. But universities, of course, have to have basic competence standards and powers. You can't have a professor who's teaching wrong science or wrong math to the students. And so if basic facts are being misrepresented, I would think universities can do something about that. But otherwise, I might be more
free
in
speech?
favor of
You
free
should be able
speech.
to go to a Hamas parade on Locust Walk at Penn as a professor?
Well, maybe we're focusing on the wrong things. I mean, so one thing, as you know, that was happening a lot of these pro-Hamas protests is it went way beyond speech. I mean, anytime they link arms and won't let somebody, let's say a Jewish person, have access to 1 inch of the campus,
right,
just 1 inch, that's not free speech anymore. Those people should be instantly disciplined, suspended, expelled. I mean, you can't do that. And that's where people, I think, should be focusing their energies. If all you're telling me is that there was a protest and somebody joined it, you and I might have different feelings about it. But there's tons more that you can do something about and that they haven't been, a lot of universities haven't been doing enough about.
And that's actually a pretty clear line. I mean, the line between speech and action is pretty clear. I'm wondering, have you been following Amy Wax's suit at the University of Pennsylvania? And it seems to me that she's, and I've interviewed her a number of times, and she seems to be on that double standard track, right, where you can use Title VI and say the way that if you are going to police speech, it has to be done equally. I mean, does that seem promising to you as a litigation strategy?
I don't know enough about the case. I cannot get a clear handle on what exactly they are saying that she did that violated their rules. I mean, we all know certain statements that she made, which just look like assertions of fact as she understood them to be, which have never been refuted, and other statements of her opinions, which I would think would be protected speech. But I have never seen, has the university come out and clearly said, look, this is what she did that violated our rules, that isn't simply the expression of opinion. So I'm confused about that case. The headlines and what you read in the newspapers make me think that she's simply being punished for her speech, which of course I would be against, but maybe there's more to it. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Well, just to say that the double standard approach does seem to me a promising one going forward, given how the indulgence of, just on this example, pro-Hamas speech, which is all fine, but then you can't, as you said, under different levels of scrutiny, you can't then crack down on other kinds of speech.
But that could go either way, right? And if they ruled that, fine, you can't have a double standard, but then you can still crack down on, air quotes, hate speech or misinformation or disinformation, I would still be very much unhappy with that result, right? Would you?
Well, I think,
let's fight. All
I
right.
think I'm a little bit, well, not less of a free speech absolutist, but, I think these campuses have real endemic problems around their treatment of Jews, basically. And so I'm interested in every tool in the toolbox to make these schools that I owe so much to and so grateful to have attended livable for an 18 or 19-year-old Jewish student. And if that means that, that Harvard is, there's the line on what people can say is maybe a little bit tighter than what we would otherwise like in the best of all possible worlds, I think I'm okay with that. I think I'm okay with,
No, you cannot be okay with that.
Not allowing students to carry, a sign that has a swastika equals a Star of David on campus.
Wow.
And these are campuses. I mean, this is not the street. I mean, these are spaces that are supposed to have certain standard and values and expectations. I mean, it's not a wilderness with a free for all.
Right,
I mean,
but those that under that same argument, then the Ben Shapiro shows up on your campus with his Israeli flag, and people claim that that's hate speech, and
but that's happening anyway.
Intimidating them.
That's happening anyway.
Right.
Is the argument.
Right. I'm saying get rid of all of it.
How do you push back?
Don't include the Jews in that crazy. Get rid of the crazy.
Well, the problem with the thing about double standards is you can fix them in two different ways.
Right.
You can raise the bar or lower the bar. Yeah. And that's what you guys are talking about. And, I would say I might be more with Rebecca on this in the following way. This idea about making people feel unsafe as a basis for suppressing speech on campus, that became a big thing over the last 10 years. And there was speech being suppressed all over the country, including at Yale, on the ground that, it made people feel unsafe, therefore suppress the speech. And I was always dead set against that. And now I sometimes hear people trying to make the same argument on behalf of Jewish students at campuses. It makes us feel unsafe when you say X, so you can't say X anymore. And I just think if we start using that as our standard, we will have lost the freedom of speech. Yeah. We will have given up too much.
Just speak to that. I know people are going to be thinking this. People sort of make a line between speech and violence, and then right in between, on the line, seems to be from the river to the sea. That line. Yeah. Some people say that is a call to violence, and some people, don't. So where do you fall on that?
You guys are asking the toughest questions. I mean, it's appalling. It's repulsive. And part of the problem is it masquerades itself as like a liberation cry. And, we're not admitting that we're calling for the extermination of a group. But so, these are all problems. But one good thing about the freedom of speech, one virtue that's a little bit underrated, unexpected, is you get to see what people actually think.
Right.
And, so I didn't know that there were lots of people at Columbia, at Yale, at Harvard, who thought, that Hamas coming in and massacring men, women, babies was good. It's important for us to know that. And so they say from the river to the sea, you might not like me for saying so, but I think they have a right to say it. So
I do like you for saying it. I agree.
But the thing that I'm coming back to with Ari is it has to be even-handed. If it turns out that they get to say that, but the universities keep clamping down on so-called hate speech, from other quarters, that is intolerable. So, and to the extent that's what's driving you, I agree with you.
Yeah, yeah. We're not starting a game at 0-0. We're starting a game at halftime where one side is up by a lot. And so I understand the even playing field, but there has to be a degree of catching up. I think, I think where I come out on this, and the thing about the protests on campus that really horrified me, the more I think about it, wasn't so much the rhetoric, but it was, as you said, Jed, it was the action. It was the signs that said, no Zionists allowed past this point, or no Zionists allowed in this student group. Now, that kind of demarcating of the territory of a campus, to me, was shocking.
Shocking. And there should be zero tolerance for that. Yeah. Those people should be. And, here's another problem, which you haven't asked about, but wearing masks on a campus so you can't tell who's saying what. Now, there's a long tradition of anonymity being protected as a matter of our First Amendment. You're allowed to publish anonymous pamphlets. But it gets to be a problem. And there are places like campuses where you need to know, is somebody a student? You're allowed to police your campus. Is it students who are here? Is it not students? But also this general, so people lock their arms. They prevent some people from getting into a place, but you don't know who they are, and there's no way to tell. And by the time the authorities get there, they're gone. But I am agreeing with you. There should be absolute zero tolerance. Those people should be instantly disciplined, suspended, maybe even expelled. It's unacceptable.
We have so much to say.
We have so many, we could be here for hours. This is an unfair question, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but I want you to grade Yale or Yale Law School on its free speech policies, practices, environment right now. And how do you feel personally being there? Do you feel free to say whatever you want? You've been through a few things at Yale, and give us an assessment.
Well, I do express my opinions, so I haven't. I just can't stop myself, basically. So I do, but it's been bad, and the atmosphere on the Yale Law campus, in terms of freedom of expression, reached a very low point a few years ago, where students really couldn't express themselves. It was just sort of peak wokeness, and if students expressed a conservative view, they would be ostracized by many of the students there, and they risked being disciplined, even if they hadn't said anything that came close to any line, and it was terrible. And I will say honestly, our dean contributed to that and was part of that. Now, in the last couple of years, I think things have gotten better. Students tell me that the culture is not nearly as bad, and that they are now able to express opinions. They don't worry so much about ostracism. There hasn't been this disciplining. And of course, administrators are political people. I mean, they see what happened to Claudine Gay, and they're like, time to shift gears here. And so they have. And after the worst of it, some people got fired. And I think things... I'm crossing my fingers, and I'm holding my breath. I'm waiting to see. I don't think it's completely over and done with yet, but I think it has improved.
Okay. Maybe on that hopeful note, Jed Rubenfeld, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great to be here with you. Thank you.
Our top story this week, Rebecca, is the war in Ukraine. It's head spinning where we are. What are some of your initial reactions to what looks like kind of rapidly coalescing agreement, at least between Trump and Putin, about the future of that war?
Right. Well, I guess we talk a lot about vibe shifts and Overton windows, and feels like quite a vibe shift from the last administration, obviously. And I think, my feeling about it was sort of, I conjured up like Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. And I know that sounds crazy, but let me explain.
Kind of good for every occasion.
Right. That works.
When don't we conjure up Tevye?
So true. This idea that on the one hand, on the other hand, Tevye, the main character, is a father of all these daughters, and they keep coming to him with sort of breaking of traditions, and he one hands it and other hands it, and usually, can argue himself into dizziness about his feelings about the situation, until he gets to his final daughter, who sort of goes too far, and he just, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and then he says, no, there is no other hand. And that's sort of what I feel like is happening here with this conversation around Ukraine and Russia. I feel like in the beginning of the war, I think Americans were largely, the polls said that we were largely supportive of supporting Ukraine in this war. And there was like a black hat, white hat narrative that emerged, and Russia was the black hat and Ukraine was the white hat, and Zelensky was hugging Sean Penn, and all of it. What we see now, more recently, things that Elon Musk has said and President Trump has said, and everybody, J.D. Vance has said, and there have been voices saying this throughout. They just haven't really gotten a lot of airtime in the mainstream media, that there are no white hats here, that there's just black hat and black hat. And a lot of people see Zelensky as, the head of a very corrupt country. They complain that there hasn't been an election. There's a debate about that. And he famously, last week, did he get on TV and sort of talk about, I don't even know where half of the money that you sent went. And on the heels of what's happening with Doge in our country about spending, I think that was really hard for people to take. And I think a lot of people, not everybody, there's a real debate about this in this country still, but there are a lot of people who've just said there is no other hand enough. They don't want to continue to engage. And Donald Trump and his administration are not throwing them overboard entirely, but I think if I were Zelensky, I would feel like I better learn to swim.
Well said. I think we disagree on this one. Well, let me first take out, I think, where there's some common ground. First,
I think we should fight first.
Well, we'll get to the fight. But, first, I think, to be fair, most people expected a negotiated settlement to end the war. I mean, Trump didn't hide the ball on this during the campaign. There's also just this war has been grinding on now for years. So, those who are totally outraged that there's movement on this front, I think, haven't been paying attention. As so often with Trump, it's not so much what's happening, but it's the sort of rhetoric and the style of it that I think has caught people off guard. And here's a classic Trump question of sort of, how do you take him seriously? Do you take him literally? What's a bargaining tactic? What's not a bargaining tactic? But, it does seem to me that the shift here is real. And I don't quite get it. I just think that saying things like, Ukraine started the war is just crazy. Right. It's just, and you don't have to be, singing Slava Ukraina to believe that. On the elections issue, it's a country at war. They have a provision for martial law in their constitution. Now, am I saying it's, the democracy of, Plato's Athens? Probably not. I agree with you there, but I just don't really see what's gained by these sort of outrageous statements. When it comes to policy issues, I don't think anyone thinks that Ukraine is going to join NATO tomorrow. The question is why sort of take that off the table to begin with? And I think there is a real realignment here towards Russia. I think where Trump is on the strongest grounds, and Vance, is to say, okay, you don't like this, what's the alternative? Right? And is it just to continue funding the Gaza war?
Announcement.
Right. Is it just to continue a war where there's no sort of, way out?
But let's start the fight. I'm going to start it. The NATO comment, that's interesting because what you just said, that you don't see why he would take it off the table. I would say that would have been the first thing I would take off the table. Why? Because initially, many people feel that this war was really provoked by Kamala Harris's announcement in Europe. I can't remember which year it was, but early on in the administration, that Ukraine might join NATO. And Russia has been saying for many years now, that's really their red line. NATO's been advancing west for decades now, in violation of agreements that we made with Russia. And they had always said, don't bring NATO to Ukraine, not up to our borders. Absolutely no. And Kamala Harris and the Biden administration say, welcome to the new American presidency, and we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO. And so Russia invaded. That's how they tell that story, and how a lot of people in this country see that story. And so the first thing you would say if you're trying to negotiate peace is Ukraine will not be in NATO.
Right. Well, there's no doubt that was a pretext for Russia's invasion. I guess the question would be, for Trump to make a separate peace with Putin without Zelensky at the table. I mean, is that really a recipe for a long-term peace agreement? And there's something, I just don't get Trump's animus towards Zelensky. I mean, this feels, there's something personal. And to be honest, with fair amounts of a kind of element of the right, there's this like really weird and to me anti-Ukrainian pro-Russian sentiment. I think it's I understand maybe
pro-Russian you read it as, or just anti-Ukrainian.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think we're seeing a wholesale endorsement of Putin's account of the war. And again, maybe this is where Trump thinks the path to a deal is, but it's sort of breathtaking, and again, maybe I'm old-fashioned this way, but I take seriously the idea of America as the leader of the so-called free world, and I think there's a cost to shedding that identity.
What about the cost of having been in this war, the cost of having pushed Russia closer to China, an alliance which we don't want to see? What about the cost of Americans looking at the monies being sent over there and the fraud? I mean, in every venture like this, there's fraud, but in this political moment, it's just the worst possible moment to be making the case that we should still be sending more money to the Ukrainians when Zelensky says, I don't even know where it's gone, half of it's gone. What about those costs?
I mean, I will see. I mean, can America detach Russia from Iran and China, or will it be seen as a great victory for Russia? That's unknown. But I take your point that sometimes isolating people forces them away from your sphere of influence and away from your values rather than toward them. I still think if you zoom out and you say, here's the largest land war in Europe. It's one of America's main antagonists. And America has managed to sort of stave off Russia pretty cheaply. I mean, I know it's not necessarily all of my money going there, but not one American soldier has died. Do I think that's been money well spent to keep Russia from Putin from marching down the streets of Kiev? I do. I mean, I think overall that's been a worthwhile effort. And even as I agree, it can't go on forever. So, we'll see what the final terms are. But it makes me nervous.
So are you in favor of a peace treaty or a peace agreement being reached, but you just don't like the way that Trump is positioning it, and you want certain terms that are favorable to Ukraine, or you would prefer to see continued support of Ukraine to continue to fight this war, and then to what end? What would the end of that look like for you?
Right. No, I think most people now agree that the war will soon come to an end. But, when Trump says things like Ukraine won't have a country anymore, or, they better be careful, it seems to me just sort of giving Russia everything it wants. I mean, the devil's in the details, as in any deal. Right.
And I'm just trying to get at what the devil is in those details for you. Is giving back the Donbass and Crimea to Russia, is that bad? A bad outcome?
Well, I think one way to think about it was, what if we replaced Ukraine with another American ally, maybe Israel or whatever? Would we give them a seat at the table, or would we impose a peace agreement, that they were uncomfortable with? I mean, Ukraine, again, for all its imperfections, is an American ally, and Russia is not.
And why do you think why do you think Russia went into Ukraine if you don't connect it to Kamala Harris?
Russia is an imperialist power that wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire. I mean, it
had nothing to do with the NATO
announcement? It's a pretext. It's a corrupt petro-imperial state. I mean, it's territorially rapacious, as most dictatorships are. It's poor, and so is in pursuit of more resources and land, and it's led by a dictator.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to leave it there, I think, but we'll see what happens, and maybe we'll talk about it in a future, and maybe we'll come to an agreement and a happy one.
Yeah.
Whatever the result
God
may be.
willing. Our tipping point this week is also going to be across the Atlantic, and that's Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich conference, where he basically told the Europeans to shape up over free speech if they want to be partners with America. And this is happening against the horizon of German elections this weekend, which have largely, I think, become emblematic of this debate over free speech, politics, and the future of Europe. So, Rebecca, we know your free speech commitments, and we love them. So did you find this sort of a thrilling address to our European friends?
It was one of those speeches that I think should go down in history. I made my twin 18-year-olds listen to it and discuss it with me. I feel like it should be read in every school. It speaks to the core values that America cares about, and we think Western Europe does, but we're not seeing a lot of evidence of it. I mean, the actual motto of the Munich Security Conference is peace through dialogue. Like, literally, dialogue is in the motto. Right. And J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, laid out the many terrible ways in which the European countries are not so interested in dialogue. He talked about the buffer zones in Britain, where you're not allowed to pray silently in your own mind within 150 meters of an abortion clinic. There was a case, somebody who was arrested for doing exactly that. Britons are not doing well in free speech, and of course, they aren't doing so well in Germany either. There's a political party there called the AfD that has been censored by everybody in the mainstream in politics and media in Germany. And whether you like what they have to say or not, whether you think they have Nazi roots or you don't, I'm not sure what that has to do with their right to speak. And the Germans disagree. And so J.D. Vance went and gave a really powerful speech sort of talking about what's happening, that security is not just about weapons and tanks and all of that, but it's about what you're securing your society for, to be the free society that you were intended to be. And so I think absolutely recommend that everybody watch that speech if they haven't, but I think it's the bigger question that you and I should really think about is there an alliance anymore of values between the U.S. and Europe? Do we share ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of religion? I would argue that under the Biden administration, we were very much aligned with Europe in violating all of the above. But this administration has a very different view of the world and of American free speech rights and civil rights, and Europe is still not on that page.
Yeah, no, that's a great take on it. I think certainly what it did was elevate this question of speech to a core American value and sort of an outward-facing value. Europe is different just sort of legalistically in that they don't have the First Amendment, right? A lot of the countries don't really have constitutions in the way we do. So I absolutely think America is the standard bearer of free speech, but is also an outlier on free speech, maybe a blessed outlier. Yes. But there's a way in which, so it makes sense that America would push other countries to sort of live towards or move towards that value. I guess the German example is a little tricky for me. So basically, just to fill people in, there is this party called the AfD. We've seen Elon Musk full-throatedly endorse it. J.D. Vance, in his speech to the Munich conference, basically endorsed it or said, you have to kind of bring them in from the cold, right? So right now there's a firewall. I don't know if he
endorsed their policies,
but he said or endorsed them as being part of the process. So just there's a firewall now, basically. No party will, on the right or the left, will partner with them.
Right, and they're almost, we should say, at 20% almost of the vote. Right. Across the country,
they're
so
scheduled to,
they're not,
they're expected to get
insignificant.
around 20% of the vote. I guess, Europe is facing challenges that are sort of similar to ours and different in ways. I mean, immigration is a huge issue there, and the AfD's success is largely due to them being hardline on immigration. And, the relevant history matters. I mean, Angela Merkel brought in 1 million Syrians with no vetting, basically, open borders, and now Germany is sort of harvesting some of the results of that.
Right, the day before this conference, right, there was an Afghani asylum seeker who rammed his car into a street full of Germans. And so, ironically, right, that would happen the day before. Vance comes to tell them not to suppress the speech of the party that is actually gaining momentum because of events exactly like that. Right.
Yeah, and there are different ways, I think, to think about this. I mean, one is to say that the AfD is actually is a sort of endorsement of the kind we've seen from Elon Musk. The other way is to say, well, in the long run, it's better off that they have a voice and voters can decide whether that's the vision or not, and that by suppressing them, you distort the political process. And I think the only part I'm somewhat sympathetic to is that when Germany says, we do have this particular past and this particular story, and so they have to, I think, negotiate their own relationship to the 20th century, and maybe the time is to move beyond that. But the memories of Nazism, the memories of extremism are still there. And I'm not advocating for the AfD to be shut down or anything, but there are undoubtedly Nazi elements to the party. There are undoubtedly anti-Semitic elements to the party and leadership. Not all of it, but a significant amount of it. And so,
but the Nazi history of Germany also serves as a terrible blind spot, right? Because they only are able to see, I think his name was Bork, the guy who had sort of said something that wasn't, but they only see that element of their history and the threat, but they don't see the huge threat coming from other precincts. And that is what groups like AFD are responding to, that you are only focused on this sort of
I'm not sure.
fear of Nazis, but not the fear of what
I'm not sure. I mean,
bringing in a million Syrians will do to us.
Right. But, in terms of, let's say, anti-Semitic speech, Germany cracks down on pro-Palestinian marches.
Yes.
I mean, you can barely even have a pro-Palestinian flag, a Palestinian flag. So, that's a whole nother debate. But yeah, I mean, I think there are choppy waters coming between America and Europe, whether it's on this issue or on the Ukraine issue.
Well, and maybe just a theoretical level, it's sort of interesting to think about. We think of ourselves as part of the same Western civilization, and we are in literature and history and all. But actually, what does that mean in today's terms if we don't share these core values? Are we part of the same Western civilization? The idea of it anymore? Are things changing?
Yeah, I have to say, I was on a reporting trip in Vienna last summer, and I happened to be in Vienna for Pride. And it was a lovely, fun day. And, this was in the peak of sort of the anti-Israel protests around the world. And there was a pro-Palestinian group, kind of Queers for Palestine kind of thing at the parade. But it was fine. There were Palestinian flags, there were signs, but it didn't feel violent. It didn't feel hateful. I said, why is this? And then I realized because it's illegal to be anti-Semitic. And I said, this is great. You know what I mean? Like because because I don't know if you saw the images for the parades in New York. It was pogrom-esque.
Yes.
And so I said, this is Vienna. This is one of the hometowns of Hitler. It's okay if they're a little stricter about people calling to kill Jews. It's okay. It's okay if there's a little restraint around walking around with Nazis equals Star of Davids.
Right.
I'm okay.
I hear you. I think I would feel the same way in that moment, but then I would look at a buffer zone in Britain and say, well, this is what happens when you're okay in that moment. And then a lot of other moments happen that you're not so okay about. And I have to go back to I even if it protects me in the moment, I don't think it's going to protect me in the long term, Jewishly, as an American. And I can't go there with you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. It just highlighted the tension for me between.
Okay. Now that we've had a little bit of an argument, I feel good that we can move on.
Fantastic.
Okay. This is our Make It Make Sense section, and Ari had a really interesting phone call this week with Sam Bankman-Fried, who is sitting in a federal prison. He ran the cryptocurrency exchange FTX. I'm sure a lot of our viewers remember that story. He has been sentenced to 25 years for, is it fraud? And I don't know what the list is, but everyone...
Conspiracy
fraud. And you published a piece about it and also the actual audio of those 3 short conversations put together on the Sun website. And I think everyone should listen to it. It was fascinating. And I want you to talk about it, but I want to just give you some thoughts that I had in listening to it and ask, then what your thoughts were. The first thing that clearly jumped out at me, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cede ground. I'm going to say, you give me your thoughts since you spoke to him.
Sure. Just to kind of fill people in, Sam Bankman-Fried was a rising star of the crypto world. He had come from the sort of quantitative trading world, got in on. He wasn't sort of the first on crypto. He wasn't one of these people who was, first in the ground. But he kind of saw opportunities in a still young industry, and used, honestly, really his extraordinary intelligence to make. I mean, killing isn't the right word. There was some talk that he was going to be the world's first trillionaire, and was on pace to be the richest person in the world. And built this crypto trading entity called FTX and another kind of hedge fund called Alameda Research. And there was a lot of money sloshing around, and he spent that money pretty widely on something like he funded a third. One of every 3 members of Congress was taking FTX money.
Yes, second largest Biden donor.
Second largest Biden donor after Mayor Bloomberg. Stadiums were being named FTX. He had to commercial with Tom Brady. There was some negotiation with Taylor Swift. So this was someone who seemed that his wealth was so enormous and at such a young age that he was set to stride across the political and cultural worlds like a colossus. And it all came crashing down. This is obviously where it gets the most heated or contested. Basically, there was a crypto crash. As sometimes when things crash, there's a bank run. Customers wanted their money, wasn't really there.
Yeah.
And he had I think it's sort of uncontested even from him that he had been using customer funds for other investments besides the kinds of thing that he had said that would be used for. And now he says, of course, that there was an understanding that wasn't illegal. It was maybe foolish. And his account is that FTX was always solvent. It just had a liquidity crisis, right? So it wasn't able to pay immediately, but the value was there.
I heard you ask him very plainly, "Are you innocent?" Or do you think? And he said yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And do you believe him? Do you think he would pass a lie detector test in that moment? Does he think he's innocent?
Absolutely. He thinks that the law is just. I think he thinks that the law just misunderstood what he was doing. I think he thinks he was the victim of, he said to me, a selective and vindictive prosecution.
Right.
The case overlaps with Trump's in interesting ways. It's the same judge as was Trump's judge in the E. Jean Carroll case. The prosecutor, Danielle Sassoon, is the one who is in the eye of the storm with the Eric Adams. So there's a kind of kinship.
Yes. And he was very careful to point that out repeatedly. I think at the very beginning I noted the opening of his comments to you, the word Trump came out right away, and so did a lot of the elements of that conversation.
There's been a lot of reporting that he's angling for a pardon,
right?
Which is going to be tough given his largesse to Democrats.
Yes.
On the other hand, he has said, and I sort of believe this, that he always gave more money to Republicans than was reported. And interestingly, to our previous conversation, the reason why it wasn't more widely disclosed was because he said journalists are going to judge me. That there was a kind of like it being in the closet as a Republican donor. I think fundamentally Sam is not a political person. I think his donations were mostly utilitarian, either for his somewhat sort of unconventional charitable beliefs or effective altruism, or just out of self-interest of a kind of regulation around crypto.
Yeah, that altruism piece also clearly came out in these conversations, and he was, childlike, I felt, in his understanding of his place in the world and his power and what he wanted to do, and still regrets that he can't do now that he doesn't have that money. What did you make of that?
Yeah, effective altruism it's never felt compelling to me because it feels almost impersonal. I forget what writer they said it about someone, but someone said, he hates people in particular, but loves humanity in general. And it just feels kind of,
like to help people over there.
Right. Yes. And that the whole point of getting rich is to give away money to these sort of abstract causes. And over time, his causes did become pretty abstract. I mean, things like existential risk, preventing an asteroid from hitting the planet, or, or preventing catastrophic climate change, or pandemic stuff. So, but I think there too, my sense is that this wasn't a front. I mean, this is sort of really how he thinks about the world.
I also was surprised, right? Because my picture from media descriptions of him before he went to jail were, of a guy wearing torn shorts and crazy
the khaki
hair.
Shorts and the white t-shirt.
And sort of hanging out on the beanbag and all the crazy sort of childlike weird behaviors. I expected in the audio portion to hear a child, and I heard an adult, obviously, but he was very intelligent and thoughtful and clear-minded. And I don't know, that just shocked me. Did that shock you?
Yeah, I mean, you never know, right? And part of why I was interested in this is because, when someone is so discussed or written about, you always kind of wonder what are they actually like. And what I think is valuable about the tapes is, the telephone is a really intimate medium, and even sometimes more intimate than talking in person, because it's just your voices, and I think you kind of hear that. And in this conversation, and there were a number of sort of off the record conversations that preceded that, I found him to be a perceptive analyst of his own sort of circumstances.
Say more about that.
Well, just able to kind of sort of diagnose, the motivation of different actors. Someone doesn't seem to be blinded by anger or grievance, almost detached in a kind of way. And Sam has argued in court documents that he is neurodivergent. This is part of his argument on appeal. I think there's some of that too.
Right.
There's a way in which it's both sort of objective and a little bit disconnected at the same time.
And what did you feel sympathy for him? I mean, he's likely to spend 25 years in prison.
How could you not feel sympathy? And I think part of it is, and this is now central to his argument, is that, everyone will get paid back in some way or another. And, my reporting on this, with other people who've analyzed what has happened after FTX imploded into bankruptcy is generally people feel that this was sort of mishandled, that a better course would have been, rather than to kind of, shut Sam out and prosecute him, to sort of try to get a little bit better sense of what he'd built before it was torn down. And some of his long-term bets really have paid off. The Solana token, for example, his investment in Anthropic, an AI startup. And, if there had been no bankruptcy, and the assets were just held rather than sold off, people would be in an even better situation today.
And so why do you think it was prosecuted the way it was?
There were well, first of all, I don't want to give short shrift to the case against Sam. I mean, there really were significant irregularities in how FTX was run, and he did sign the document handing over the company to Sullivan and Cromwell and to the bankruptcy, and with advice of counsel. So this, the argument that he was forced hasn't really flown in court, and I think for good reason. He's definitely a sophisticated client, but I think people saw an opportunity. Sullivan and Cromwell has made hundreds of millions of dollars off this case. It's their biggest matter ever they've handled as a firm. And that's just a fact. I'm not saying that it's criminal, but it's there's a lot of money involved here. And I do think, like many, kind of iconic legal cases, they become sort of emblematic, and this became emblematic of crypto. Yeah. And this sort of almost like a parable.
Yeah. And so just give us your big takeaway from this conversation, I guess, or anything that might have surprised you or you weren't expecting, other than the interruptions of, this is a call from a federal prison, which sort of punctuated your conversation. I don't know. What'd you learn?
I think prisons are tough places. And I didn't visit Sam. I was on the phone, but I have been to federal prisons before. Always was able to leave. But it's 25 years is a really long time. I do think Sam has a lot to offer the world, and he made mistakes, and juries found them criminal. I'm not whitewashing that, but I don't know. I'd like to see at some point at least him get to do his thing again. Yeah. I think
he'll be how old when he gets out?
He'll be in his 50s.
Yeah. Well, there's life for us yet.
There's so much life.
This is Sunburn. And boy, we both have the same one. I don't know who wants to rant first. Should I?
I'll go. I thought, the depths of the horror of what has been done to the hostages couldn't get any worse. And I just, it's like a floor that keeps bottoming out, or an elevator shaft that reveals further and further brutality.
Yes.
And it's just been I don't know if surprising is the right word, but shocking, the news of the Bibas family being horrifically murdered in ways that are just Dante in the Inferno.
The children, at least we know,
couldn't have invented.
Right.
And I come back to something that I know a mentor of mine, and I think one of yours too, Ruth Weiss, says, and that's to stare in the face the fact that you are hated is really an uncomfortable thing. And but it should steel one's resolve, and I think this has been the year and a half of losing illusions, and living without illusions is a tough way to live, but that decision is made by the enemy, is made by others, and so I think Israel now has to proceed. And I'm not going to prescribe what policy Israel should pursue. There are hostages who are alive who need to be gotten out, but whatever choice is made, it has to be made clear-eyed and with no illusion.
Yeah. Well, yes, to everything that you just said. And I guess my reaction, there are too many things to even say. You kind of do it an injustice by even speaking about it on some level. So I just want to say that, and that Shiri is still, her whereabouts are unknown, and that they faked the body in the coffin is just a thing that a human brain couldn't really come up with. And also, I want to mention Oded Lifshitz, who was in his 80s, and for a man to have spent the last years of his life in that way is another kind of cruelty, too. I look at this and I just think, just like individuals can be sick, can get sick, so can societies get sick. And if you vote for a terrorist organization to run your country, even if you're an innocent, decent human being, the soup in which you are stewing is diseased. It's rancid. And we've seen, the consequences of that, not just in the direct, attacks and murders and rapes and brutality against these individuals, but, in the parades that they have, in which fathers bring their toddlers as though,
the dead baby parades.
And the parents bringing their kids to watch these coffins be paraded around in Gaza before they're sent back, and as though it's like, the 4th of July parade. That's a sick society. And I think when you're sick, you either, people get sick, okay? It happens, but you either try to cure the disease or you succumb to it. And it feels like Gazan society has succumbed to the disease. And that isn't a call to kind of, I don't know what it's a call to do, but it's a call, maybe as you're sort of suggesting, to finally recognize it, to look it in the eye and say what it is, and not to excuse it anymore, and not to point to the 10 righteous men in the city and say, but for them, but to say something very big has to change here. This isn't a precision strike here. This whole society has been for 20 some odd years now, taught things that we can't imagine, and we see the outcome, and it is it's untenable. And I think we're hearing that now. And I think I just want to say also, it's not new, sadly. Children have been butchered before. Family that my cousins knew in Toccoa were beaten to death, like young children were beaten to death in a cave and their blood smeared on the walls. I mean, it's not that it's new, it's just the buildup of this, and then the sort of spectacle of it, and not just the brutality, but the joy around their brutality, the boasting about their brutality, that I think has turned the switch in people. And, just enough is enough isn't even enough to say. But it feels like enough is enough now. Yeah,
and I think this question of this movement and both in Gaza and abroad is the kind of Palestinian is a deeply troubled movement. It's a movement that is tainted by violence and hate and rule breaking and chaos. And that movement doesn't have a right to a state. It doesn't have a right to autonomy. It doesn't have a right to hurt people. It's like, you have a psychotic neighbor, that's okay, but they can't start, smashing in the walls of your house. Right. It's a psychotic neighbor. And I think the paradigm needs to move away from sort of, it's this innocence being oppressed by Hamas to kind of like a denazification, or de-imperialization of Japan. I mean, you had a lot of similar issues in, where an ideology had permeated every element of society and enabled atrocities that are almost surreal. Yeah, and just to build on what you just said, it's not just a psychotic neighbor, right? It's a psychotic neighbor with bubonic plague who opens the window every time you pass by and coughs on you deliberately.
they infect. Look at the Red Cross, right? At their behavior throughout this. They never visited the hostages to make sure that they were okay, and then they stand on stage with them and shake their hands as they were doing these sick processionals. And I think I read a statement by the Red Cross after this incident, and they sort of, the first thing they did was to sort of say, well, we don't check the bodies. It's not our fault. They sort of, that was their primary concern, not what had actually happened. I mean, it's a disgrace. Everything that comes near an illness like that contracts the illness. Yeah. And so we have to be even more vigilant now to cure this disease.
Absolutely. Okay. Rebecca, thank you. See you next week.
See you next week, Ari.